Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast, where we aim to learn how history impacts current events and affects our lives today through the lens of politics, the economy, technology, and business trends. I may be an AI, but your host, well, he is not artificial in any way. Here is Jeff Kellick.
April 9th, 1865, Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Robert E. Lee surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant. The Civil War, 4 years, 600,000 dead, is over. The Union has been preserved. Slavery will be abolished. That much is certain. But something else has changed. Something that won't be obvious for decades. Something most Americans at the time don't even realize. The Constitution itself has been shattered. Not on paper. The document still reads the same. Article 1, Section 8 still has the same enumerated powers. The 10th Amendment still reserves powers to the states. But the war has broken something fundamental. The old constitutional order, Madison's careful balance between federal restraint and state sovereignty, that order died somewhere between Fort Sumter and Appomattox. In its place, something new will emerge. Not immediately, not obviously, but irreversibly. Over the next 70 years, from 1865 to 1937, America will live under what legal historians call the new Constitution. Not because the text changed that much, but because 3 amendments, ratified in the immediate aftermath of the war, they will fundamentally redefine what the Constitution means. The federal government that Lincoln mobilized to win the war, it won't fully demobilize. The federal power that Grant wielded to destroy slavery won't fully recede. And the question of who protects individual rights, states or the national government, that will be answered permanently. I am Jeff Kellick, and this is From General Welfare to the Great Society on the Consequential Actions podcast. Today, episode 3, Reconstruction, Industrialization, and the Rise of a New Constitution, a Second Founding. When the war ends, Congress faces a question without precedent. How do you bring defeated states back into the Union? And how do you guarantee that slavery, the institution that seeded the divide and ultimately caused the war, stays dead? The answer is 3 constitutional amendments, ratified between 1865 and 1870. They will transform American federalism more than anything since the original Constitution. Let me walk you through them, because understanding what they say and what they don't say is essential to everything that follows. The 13th Amendment, ratified December 1865. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. That's it. 13 words that end a morally corrupt institution. Not state by state, not gradually, not with some form of recompense that equated men to property. Abolished everywhere by federal command. Now that may seem straightforward. Of course, slavery should be abolished. But think about what this amendment does constitutionally. The 10th Amendment says powers not delegated to the federal government are reserved to the states. But now the federal government is reaching into the states and abolishing an institution that existed under state law, rewriting state property law, overriding state sovereignty. From a libertarian perspective, this is a little complicated. On one hand, slavery, that's the ultimate violation of liberty, right? It's government-sanctioned bondage. Ending it is necessary, essential, non-negotiable. But on the other hand, the means of ending it, federal imposition over state objections, that breaks the Madisonian framework. It wasn't that states would be granted the privilege to re-enter the Union by choosing to abolish the practice in their own constitution. No, that's not how it happened. Federal power expands dramatically to make that happen. And that power, once exercised, remains available for other purposes. The 13th Amendment is morally imperative, or I should say the results of the 13th Amendment is morally imperative, but it's also constitutionally revolutionary. Now, the 14th Amendment, ratified July 1868. This is the big one. This is where everything changes. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Let's unpack what this means, because it's one of the most consequential passages in American law. First, birthright citizenship. All persons born in the United States are citizens. This overturns Dred Scott, the 1857 Supreme Court case that said Black Americans couldn't be citizens. Now citizenship is automatic, universal, equal. You're born here, you're a citizen, period. Second, privileges or immunities. No state shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens. This language, and we'll come back to it because the Supreme Court is about to gut it. This was meant to protect fundamental rights from state violation. Things like freedom of speech, contract, property, movement. Third, due process. No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This mirrors the Fifth Amendment, which applies to the federal government, but now it applies to states too, protecting individual rights from violation by the states. This is heavy, heavy language. It's still being debated today vis-a-vis the incorporation doctrine, right? And we'll talk more about that in due course. Fourth, equal protection. No state shall deny any person equal protection of the laws. This means states can't discriminate arbitrarily. They can't treat people differently under the law without legitimate reason. Here's what's revolutionary about this. The Constitution originally limited federal government. The Bill of Rights said Congress shall make no law, not states, Congress. But the 14th Amendment flips that. Now the Constitution limits states, and more than that, it makes the federal government the enforcer of individual rights against states' governments. Madison's dual federalism, separate spheres of federal and state power, that just died. The federal government is now the ultimate guarantor of individual rights, individual liberty. Not by staying out of the way, but by actively policing states. From a libertarian perspective, this is complicated. On one hand, it's exactly what's needed. States violated rights, states enslaved people, states denied equal protection. Someone has to check power, if not the federal government, who? On the other hand, you've just made federal power potentially limitless. If the federal government is responsible for securing all individual rights against state violations, where does that power end? What doesn't count as securing rights? That question, where does the 14th Amendment's reach end? That will shape constitutional law for the next century and a half. It's still being fought over today. The 15th Amendment, ratified February 1870. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on the account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This one seems simpler. No racial discrimination in voting. Black men, women won't get to vote until the 19th Amendment in 1920, but black men can now vote. Except there is a loophole. It only prohibits discrimination on race. It doesn't prohibit literacy tests, poll taxes, property requirements, or any other pseudo-neutral barrier that just happens to exclude black voters. And over the next few decades, the southern states, they'll exploit that loophole ruthlessly. But more on that later too. So let me summarize these three amendments. What have the Reconstruction amendments done? 1, they've abolished slavery by federal command, overriding state law. 2, they've created birthright citizenship, making American citizens of a nation first, their state second. 3, they've imposed federal standards for due process and equal protection on states. 4, they protected voting rights from racial discrimination. And 5, they've given Congress the power to enforce all of this through appropriate legislation. This isn't a grammatical edit to the Constitution. This is rewriting it. The balance between federal and state power, that's permanently shifted. States are no longer sovereign in the Madisonian sense. They're now subject to federal oversight when individual rights are at stake. Was this necessary? Yeah. Slavery had to end. Equal citizenship had to be guaranteed, and federal power, that was the only force strong enough to accomplish that. Were there other potential ways to do that in the aftermath of the Civil War? Potentially. Historians argue and debate that. But now what we have to ask, was it the end of limited government? Also, yes. Because once you grant federal government the authority to secure individual rights, you've opened a door that's very hard to close. And here's the tragedy. Within 5 years, that door will be pushed almost completely shut again. Not through repeal, but through interpretation. The Supreme Court is about to gut the Reconstruction Amendments, particularly the Privileges or Immunities Clause, leaving them as dead letters for nearly a century. Let's see how that happens. It's 1873, only 5 years after the 14th Amendment was ratified, and the Supreme Court hears its first major case interpreting what the amendment means. The case is called the Slaughterhouse cases, and it's about butchers in New Orleans. Louisiana has granted a monopoly to one slaughterhouse company, the Crescent City Company. Every butcher in New Orleans has to use their facility and pay their fees. A group of independent butchers sues. They say, this violates our rights under the 14th Amendment, specifically our privileges and immunities as citizens. We have a right to practice our trade without state-granted monopolies. Now, this might seem like a technical case about business regulation, but it's really a case about what the 14th Amendment means. And the court's answer will determine whether Reconstruction's promise gets fulfilled or betrayed. Justice Samuel Miller writes the majority opinion, and he takes a very narrow view of the 14th Amendment. Miller says, yes, the 14th Amendment creates federal citizenship, but it doesn't fundamentally change the relationship between citizens and their state governments. There are two kinds of citizenship, he argues. Federal citizenship. This gives you the rights to access federal courts, protection on the high seas, the right to travel between states. These are protected by the Privileges or Immunities Clause. State citizenship? This gives you all your normal civil rights, property, contract, occupation, speech. These are not protected by the Privileges or Immunities Clause. These remain state matters. In other words, the Privileges or Immunity Clause protects almost nothing. Just a handful of specifically federal rights, not the broad civil liberties the amendment's framers intended. With one opinion, the Supreme Court has gutted the most important clause of the 14th Amendment, the Privileges or Immunities Clause. The part that was supposed to protect fundamental rights from state violation is now essentially meaningless. Why did Miller do this? The opinion suggests he was worried that a broad reading would make the federal judiciary the overseer of all state legislation, worried about destroying federalism entirely, worried about overwhelming the courts with rights claims. They're not crazy concerns. A truly broad Privileges or Immunity Clause would fundamentally alter American governance. But Miller's solution, gutting the cause entirely, threw out the baby with the bathwater. There's a powerful dissent in Slaughterhouse. Justice Stephen Field argues the majority has rendered the 14th Amendment pointless, that it's betrayed the amendment's purpose. Field says, the whole point of the 14th Amendment was protect individual rights from state governments. If it only protects a handful of trivial federal rights, what was the point? Why did we fight a war? But Field loses, the butchers lose, and the Privileges and Immunities Clause dies. Here's what makes this so tragic. In 1873, the same time Slaughterhouse has decided Reconstruction is ending. Federal troops are withdrawing from the South. The political will to protect freedom is evaporating. And the Supreme Court, which could have used the 14th Amendment to enforce equal citizenship, instead defangs it. What follows is one of the darkest chapters in American constitutional history. By 1877, Reconstruction is officially over. The Compromise of 1877, settling the disputed presidential election, withdraws the last federal troops from the South, and white supremacy reasserts itself violently, systematically, under the protection of state laws. What emerges is Jim Crow, a comprehensive system of racial segregation and disenfranchisement, enforced by law and violence. And it will last nearly a century. And the Supreme Court, the court that's supposed to enforce the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection, it will permit it, prove it, constitutionalize it. Let me take you through the key cases, because understanding how the court betrayed the Reconstruction Amendments helps us understand why constitutional law matters and why very bad interpretations have real human costs. Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. Homer Plessy, a man who is 1/8 black, sits in a whites-only railroad car in Louisiana. He's arrested under a state law requiring racial segregation. He sues, arguing that forced segregation violates the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection. The Supreme Court says no, 7-1. Justice Henry Brown writes the majority opinion, and his reasoning is, and I'll let you judge for yourself. Brown says the 14th Amendment requires legal equality, not social equality. States can separate the races as long as the facilities are equal. Segregation doesn't stamp black citizens with a badge of inferiority. Brown argues if they feel inferior, that's because they choose to view it that way. Separate but equal. That's the doctrine. Segregation is constitutional as long as, in theory, the facilities are equivalent. Except everyone knows that they're not. Black schools get a fraction of the funding. Black railroad cars are older, dirtier. Black facilities are always inferior. That's the whole point of segregation. But the court looks away. It pretends that legal separation doesn't create social subordination. It pretends that separate but equal is anything other than a contradiction in terms. There is one dissent. Justice John Marshall Harlan, a Kentuckian, a former slave owner who has evolved on racial questions. Harlan writes, "Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens." He continues, "This decision will, quote, stimulate aggressions, more or less brutal and irritating, upon the admitted rights of colored citizens." Harlan was right. Plessy became the legal foundation for 6 decades of apartheid. It gave constitutional blessing to a racial caste system. Now, a libertarian might say the problem isn't the federal government failed to intervene. The problem is the state governments imposed segregation in the first place. If states have just left people alone, let private businesses decide who to serve, let individuals associate freely, segregation would have withered. Maybe. But segregation wasn't just private discrimination. It was state-mandated separation. State law that said you must segregate, state violence that enforced it. And when state governments violate rights, someone has to check them. That's what the 14th Amendment was supposed to do, and the courts refused. But Plessy is just the beginning. Over the next 30 years, the courts will approve one segregationist law after another. Berea College versus Kentucky, 1908. Kentucky passes a law prohibiting integrated education, even in private schools, even in colleges. Berea College, a private institution that had been teaching black and white students together since 1868, over 40 years at the time of this case, they sue. The court upholds the law, says Kentucky can force even private institutions to segregate. Think about that. The same liberty of contract doctrine that the court uses to strike down labor laws, and we'll talk about that in a moment, somehow doesn't protect a private college's freedom to admit whom it wants. Corgan versus Buckley, 1926. White property owners in Washington, D.C. create a racially restricted covenants, contracts saying they won't sell to black buyers. The court upholds these, says private racial discrimination doesn't violate the 14th Amendment, only state action does. Except these covenants were enforced by courts, state courts, using state power to prevent black families from buying homes. But the court looks away again. Here's the pattern. When states want to regulate economic activity, set minimum wages, limit working hours, the court strikes those laws down as violations of liberty. But when states want to mandate racial segregation, deny equal facilities, enforce apartheid, the court says that's fine. That's within the state's police power. Liberty matters, apparently, but only when it's convenient, not when it's principled. Legal scholar Charles Black, writing in 1960, he would later demolish the intellectual foundations of separate but equal. Black pointed out that segregation's entire purpose was subordination. Nobody segregated white people to protect them from black people. Nobody worried about white children being harmed by integrated schools. The claim that segregation was somehow neutral, that it didn't create inequality, that was the worst combination of moral indifference and intellectual dishonesty. And yet, it stood as constitutional law from 1896 to 1954. 58 years. Now, why does this matter for our story about federal power? Because it shows the inadequate foresight of the original writers, not anticipating what they absolutely should have, what was foreseeable even at the time. The failure of Madisonian restraint when allowing systematic, institutional, human injustice. Madison's Constitution said, leave most things to the states, trust local control, federal intervention is dangerous. But what happens when the states are the problem? When state governments are systematically violating human rights, when local majorities oppress minorities? The Reconstruction amendments were supposed to answer that. They said federal power can check state power when rights are at stake. But the court refused. It clung to the old dual federalism, separate state and federal spheres, even though the amendments had fundamentally altered that system. This is the libertarian reckoning with American history. Sometimes liberty requires federal intervention. Sometimes rights need protection from state governments, not just from Washington. And when the courts failed to provide that protection, the consequences were catastrophic, not just for constitutional theory, but for millions of human lives. While the court is betraying Reconstruction, something else is happening. Something that will ultimately make Madison's limited federal government impossible to sustain. America is industrializing. In 1870, America is still largely agricultural. Most people live on farms or in small towns. Transportation is by horse or railroad. Communication takes days. By 1900, America is an industrial powerhouse. Steel mills, oil refineries, textile factories. Railroads crisscross the continent. Telegraph and telephone connect cities instantaneously. Corporations are larger than many state governments. This isn't gradual change. This is revolutionary transformation, and within a single generation. And it's breaking the constitutional framework. Here's the problem. The Constitution was written for a world of local markets, state-based economies. The Commerce Clause grants power to Congress to regulate commerce amongst several states, meaning that trade crossed state lines. But what happens when everything crosses state lines? A railroad company operates in 20 states. Who regulates it? 20 different state legislatures? A corporation in New Jersey sells products nationwide. Each state can impose its own safety standards, its own labor laws. That seems impossible to manage. A financial panic in New York crashes banks in California. Can states handle that separately? No, the systems are interconnected. Madison's enumerated powers were designed for a world where most economic activity was local. But that world is disappearing. Congress responds with national regulation. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 creates the first regulatory commission, the Interstate Commerce Commission. It's supposed to regulate railroad rates, prevent discrimination, and ensure reasonable access. Initially, it's pretty weak. The ICC can investigate and recommend, but it can't really enforce. Courts overturn its decisions regularly. But it's still a precedent. A federal agency with ongoing regulatory authority. That's new. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. This declares monopolies and conspiracies in restraint of trade are illegal. Gives federal courts powers to break up trust busting. In theory, this is about protecting competition and consumer welfare. In practice, at least initially, it's often used against labor unions rather than the corporations. But again, it's a precedent. Federal economic regulation expanding. And then the 16th Amendment, 1913, authorizes a federal income tax. This is huge. Before this, federal revenue came mostly from tariffs and excise taxes. Yes, there was a federal income tax during the Civil War and a brief period thereafter, but that was ruled unconstitutional. Now, with the amendment, Washington can tax incomes directly. That creates fiscal capacity orders of magnitude larger than anything the founders imagined. Combined with the Federal Reserve Act this very same year, creating a central bank to manage the money supply, You built the infrastructure for a powerful central state. Though nobody quite realizes it yet, because Congress is still relatively restrained in how it uses these powers. The progressive era sees some regulation, but nothing like what's coming in the 1930s. But here's what's interesting. While Congress is expanding regulatory power, the Supreme Court is using the 14th Amendment to protect economic liberty. This is where the so-called Lochner era begins, named after a case we need to discuss. We've talked about how the court gutted the Privileges or Immunity Clause in Slaughterhouse, and how it refused to enforce equal protection in Jim Crow cases. But there's a third clause in the 14th Amendment, due process. No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The court said privileges or immunities means almost nothing, but it starts saying liberty in the due process clause means quite a lot. Specifically, it means liberty of contract, the freedom to make economic agreements without paternalistic state interference. Legalized versus Louisiana, 1897. The court, for the first time, uses the 14th Amendment to strike down an economic regulation. Louisiana tried to regulate insurance companies. The court says, no, that violates liberty. Justice Rufus Peckham writes the term liberty means not only the right of the citizen to be free from physical restraint, but also the right to be free in enjoyment of all his faculties, to be free to use them in all lawful ways, to live and work where he will, to earn his livelihood by any lawful calling, to pursue any livelihood or avocation. That's an expansive definition of liberty. It's protecting economic autonomy, voluntary exchange, freedom to contract. From a libertarian perspective, this is great. Finally, the 14th Amendment is doing what it should, limiting government power. Lochner versus New York, 1905. New York passes a law saying bakers can't work more than 60 hours a week or 10 hours a day. The state says this is about public health. Excessive hours lead to unsanitary condition, exhausted workers, contaminated bread. Joseph Lochner, a bakery owner, is convicted of violating this law. He appeals, arguing the law violates his liberty of contract and that of his employees. The Supreme Court, 5-4, agrees with Lochner. Justice Peckham again writes the majority. He says, the right to contract about employment is part of the liberty protected by the 14th Amendment. Unless the state can show a genuine health justification, it can't interfere. And New York hasn't shown that. Baking isn't especially an unhealthy profession. This isn't really about health, it's about paternalism. The state is trying to protect the workers from themselves, to dictate how they bargain. That's not legitimate. Now, there are two famous dissents. Justice Harlan says the court is second-guessing the legislature's factual judgment. There is evidence that excessive hours harms health. The court shouldn't substitute its judgment for the elected branches. And Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes writes an even more scathing dissent. The 14th Amendment does not enact Mr. Herbert Spencer's social statics. Herbert Spencer was a British philosopher who believed in extreme laissez-faire economics. Holmes is saying the Constitution doesn't enshrine any particular economic theory. It allows legislators to experiment with different approaches. If the court strikes down every labor law it disagrees with, it's imposing its own policy preferences, not interpreting law. So here's the dilemma. From the majority's perspective, liberty of contract is a real right. People should be free to make their own employment agreements. The state shouldn't be able to override voluntary arrangements between consenting adults just because it thinks it knows better. This is about protecting autonomy, preventing paternalism, preserving economic freedom. From the dissenter's perspective, the court is obstructing democratic reform, each state's ability to experiment, in modern terms, to ideate. If a state's elected representatives believe workers and employers do not bargain on equal terms, that one side has more power, more leverage, or even creates adverse conditions to employment within the state statutes, then the state may try to level the playing field, protect the vulnerable, or even its reputation per its constituent mandate. This is about pragmatism, recognizing economic reality, allowing government to address genuine problems. Both sides have a point. Yes, liberty of contract is a legitimate constitutional value. Voluntary exchange should be protected. Government shouldn't micromanage every employment relationship. But also, contracts can be created within a state's regulatory purview. If the state regulates to prevent exploitation in their legal view, then there's representative value in such a policy, as well as an arguable individual right at stake for both employees and voters. The Lochner court tried to protect economic liberty against state overreach, but it did so inconsistently, striking down labor laws while upholding segregation. It defended liberty when economically convenient, ignored it when morally crucial. And here's what's coming. By the 1930s, during the Great Depression, Lochner-era jurisprudence will look politically absurd. When unemployment hits 25%, when banks are falling, when people are desperate, telling them you have liberty of contract rings hollow. The New Deal will sweep away these doctrines, not through careful legal reasoning, but through political populism, pressure, and crises. But that's a story we'll save for the next episode. Before we close, there's one more piece of this puzzle. World War I. If Reconstruction redefined why federal government might act, World War I demonstrated how much power it could exercise when it chose to. When America enters the war in 1917, President Woodrow Wilson doesn't just mobilize the military. Yes, he follows Lincoln's example of executive wartime power, but he also expounds upon it. He mobilizes the entire economy. War Industry Board coordinates all industrial production, tells factories what to make, allocates raw materials, sets prices. Food and Fuel Administrations controls agricultural production, rations food, manages energy supplies. Railroad Administration nationalizes the railroads, literally takes them over and runs them as a single system. Selective Service Acts conscripts millions of men, forced military service. And the Espionage and Sedition Act criminalized criticism of the war, dissent, anti-draft advocacy. Eugene Debs, a socialist leader, goes to prison for giving an anti-war speech. Wilson's government planned the economy, censored speech, imprisoned dissenters, and jailed pacifists, all in the name of a national emergency. Now, some of this was arguably necessary. Fighting a modern industrial war required coordination. You can't leave munitions production to market forces when you're fighting for survival. But here's what matters for constitutional history. It created precedent. It showed that the federal government could, when it deemed necessary, regulate virtually everything. Prices, production, labor, speech. The entire economy could be directed from Washington. And when the war ended, Most of these powers were relinquished. The railroads were returned to private ownership. Price controls ended. The economy demobilized. But the precedent remained. The infrastructure and administrative control, the agencies, the regulations, the habit of federal direction, that stayed in the institutional memory. 20 years later, when Franklin Roosevelt faces economic catastrophe, he'll point explicitly to Wilson's wartime model. He'll say, if we can mobilize the nation for war, we can mobilize it for economic recovery. The constitutional barriers that might have restrained him, enumerated powers, limits on federal authority, will seem quaint, out of touch, obstacles to necessary action. After all, if Woodrow Wilson could control the economy during wartime, why can't FDR do the same during Depression? That's a question the Supreme Court will have to answer in 1937. And we know how it answered it. Yeah. So that's the new Constitution. Not the one written in 1787, but the one that emerged between 1865 and 1920, grappling with the need for new power, new authority, new federal roles. For the executive branch, the Civil War created emergency precedents for Lincoln against the people, both Southerners and Northerners, in order to protect people. Wilson would do the same in time of World War, which would eventually lead Roosevelt and others to look to make wars on domestic related issues in order to attain popular consent, again, for emergency actions by the federal government. Legislatively, the Reconstruction Amendments redefined federal-state relations forever. They made the federal government the guarantor of individual rights, at least in theory. But the Supreme Court betrayed that promise. It gutted the Privileges or Immunities Clause in Slaughterhouse. It permitted Jim Crow and Plessy. It failed to enforce equal protection where it mattered most for the people that the amendments were designed to protect. Yet that same court used the 14th Amendment's due process to protect economic liberty. Liberty of contract became constitutional doctrine, applied inconsistently, defended selectively, but real. Meanwhile, industrialization created national markets that state-by-state regulation simply couldn't handle. Congress responded with the first federal regulatory agencies, the income tax, central banking, building the infrastructure of national economic management. And World War I demonstrated that when Washington wanted to, it could control the entire economy. Plan production, set prices, conscript labor. The precedent was set, even if the powers were temporarily relinquished. So, by 1920, America lives under a hybrid constitutional order, a system of contradictions. Dual federalism in theory, separate federal and state spheres, enumerated powers, Madisonian restraint. But national integration in practice, railroads spanning the continent, corporations larger than state governments, an economy that couldn't be managed by 48 separate state legislatures. Courts defending some liberty, property rights, freedom of contract, economic autonomy, but not other liberty, not racial equality, not civil rights, not equal protection for those who needed it most. Federal power expanding slowly, reluctantly, crisis by crisis, but unmistakably expanding. This unstable equilibrium cannot last, and it won't. Next time, we'll witness how the Great Depression shatters this fragile system completely. How Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal tests every constitutional boundary left standing, and the Supreme Court strikes back, declaring programs unconstitutional. How FDR, frustrated and desperate, threatens to pack the court with friendly justices, 6 new seats to override the 9 old men blocking his agenda. And how in 1937, in a series of decisions that will define American government for the next century, the court reverses course, abandons dual federalism, embraces Hamilton's view of unlimited federal spending power, and erases the last meaningful structural limits on federal authority. The constitutional revolution of 1937, when everything we've been building toward finally breaks. Episode 4, The Constitutional Revolution of 1937, Helvering and Wickard, the year liberty lost its structural armor. But before we get there, I want you to think about something. The Lochner court tried to protect economic liberty while tolerating racial apartheid. It defended property rights while ignoring equal protection. It struck down minimum wage laws for bakers, but upheld state-mandated segregation. Could any libertarian defense of limited government succeed when it's so morally compromised? When the most important liberty, freedom from bondage, from caste, from state-sanctioned subordination, is unprotected by the very judges claiming to defend liberty. The New Deal will sweep away Lochner-era jurisprudence, and many will cheer because Lochner failed where it mattered most. But in destroying an inconsistent and selective defense of liberty, will we destroy the principle of limited government itself? That's the question 1937 will answer, and the answer will shape America for generations. Thanks for joining me on this difficult but necessary episode. Understanding Jim Crow's constitutional failure, Lochner's moral blindness, and industrialization's pressure on the old order, all of this is essential for what comes next. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been From General Welfare to the Great Society on the Consequential Actions podcast. If you enjoy this type of content and exploration of history, be sure to subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com. And check out our written articles as well. From our corresponding article series on General Welfare Clause to what happens after the Cold War to present day, as well as a detailed analysis of U.S. political theory, economics, and technology. We will continue to post articles and welcome your participation at consequentialactions.com or follow me on X at jkellick. Until next time, have a great day.